2 of Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 14B. Without objection, the chair may recess the committee at any point. The committee is meeting today to consider a collection of 9 significant legislative proposals. These bills underscore the committee's commitment to the education, safety, and security of our children and our communities. Seeing as we have a packed agenda before us, I will quickly introduce each bill and highlight its importance, though without respect to the particular order in which the specific pieces of legislation will be considered. On the agenda is Representative Mary Miller's, Republican of Illinois, Title IX Congressional Review Act, CRA, resolution of disapproval. This resolution does nothing more than reinforce a biological and common sense reality that we all know deep down is true. Women should be safe in intimate spaces, and men should not compete in women's sports. Sex differences are biological, an inescapable fact acknowledged by most Americans. The Biden rule to allow men to intrude into women's spaces and take opportunities away from women is deeply unsettling and, frankly, unnatural. Moreover, the rule sets an uneasy precedent. Where does the destruction and erasure of women's spaces end? The softball field, the locker room, the bathroom, the prison cell. We should reject this aberration of an executive action and instead support Representative Miller's CRA resolution that would strengthen Title IX protections for young females. We will also consider a tranche of 3 bills aimed at protecting American values and interests from foreign interference. I want to thank Republican Study Committee Chair Kevin Hern for introducing the first of the 3. The Protect Our Kids Act, or H.R. 6816. This bill addresses the urgent need to safeguard children from undue foreign influence by proposing a cut to all K-12 funding from the Chinese Communist Party. Building on the Protect Our Kids Act, the Combating the Lies of Authoritarians in Schools Systems Act, or the CLASS Act, authored by Representative David Joyce and Representative Elise Stefanik, would require the disclosure of all foreign funding to K-12 schools. Under this bipartisan bill, K-12 schools would send the name, country, amount, and other pertinent foreign funding details to the Secretary of Education. We will also be marking up a bill introduced by Representative Aaron Bean, the Transparency in Reporting of Adversarial Contributions to Education Act, TRACE Act, H.R. 8649. This bill would enshrine parents' rights to know about any foreign government funding and influence that could potentially be impacting their K-12 child's education. Parents will have the right to review curricula provided by foreign governments and be informed of any contracts or financial agreements with foreign entities of concern. This transparency empowers parents, a key theme of the committee's work. These 3 bills act like bricks in a wall. Together, their individual nuances will help fortify a solid legislative structure to combat malignant foreign influence. We will also be marking up a pair of bills as part of the committee's ongoing effort to stamp out anti-Semitism. First, H.R. 8648, the Civil Rights Protection Act of 2024, was introduced by Representative Lori Chavez-DeRemer. This bill requires institutions to be transparent about their Title VI investigations and establishes minimum standards for these processes. It also outlines additional requirements for the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights when investigating Title VI claims, ensuring thorough and fair investigations of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. Moving on, we will mark up H.R. 8606, the Never Again Education Reauthorization and Study Act of 2024, introduced by Representative Buddy Carter. October 7 was the worst day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, and H.R. 8606 will ensure that the lessons of history are not forgotten in these troubling times. First, the bill commissions a study on Holocaust education in public schools. Moreover, it will extend the United States Holocaust Museum's efforts to disseminate Holocaust education resources through fiscal year 2030. Also on the agenda is H.R. 7227, the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act, which establishes a commission to investigate and address the historical impacts of Indian boarding school policies. This commission will be a bipartisan effort to unearth the jarring history of Indian boarding schools and their potential violations of American Indian rights. We'll mark up H.R. 8534, Representative Bob Good's Protecting Student Athletes Economic Freedom Act. This bill safeguards the economic freedom of student athletes from misclassification by NLRB bureaucrats. Athletes deserve the freedom to play the sport they love and receive a high-quality education at the same time. Reclassifying these athletes as employees could undermine that freedom and threaten their academic journeys, turning the sports they love into a chore instead. The final item on the agenda is H.R. 618, the Improving Access to Workers' Compensation for Injured Federal Workers Act, sponsored by Representative Tim Walberg. Representative Walberg has been a consistent fighter for workers' rights, and this bill builds on that legacy by extending access to the Federal Employees Compensation Act program to services performed by physician assistants and nurse practitioners. The absence of these services is a glaring gap in the current federal workers' compensation system, and this bill presents an opportunity to rectify the law with medical reality. A physician is not always available or necessary for many medical services. The bill would increase access to care for federal workers, especially in rural areas, so that they can receive treatment and get back to work faster. Together, these 9 bills express...
Intending to speak at this moment, but I think it's appropriate. I greatly appreciate the efforts of my colleague, Representative Chavez de Remer, to address this effort, or for her effort to address anti-Semitism on college campuses at this time. But I do want to acknowledge what my colleagues have noted, which is that these bills, this one and the prior bill, were introduced only last Friday, less than a week ago, giving us very little time to work across the aisle and potentially reach agreement on issues that we have with certain provisions of these bills, and this bill in particular, to address unintended consequences, to make sure we're voting on the best possible legislation that will truly address the frightening rise of anti-Semitism and the failure of so many colleges and universities, as we have seen in this committee, to help Jewish students, to keep them safe on college campuses. And I must note at this moment that we have a comprehensive bipartisan bill that was introduced more than a month ago that would address so many of these issues in these bills today and many more issues. That is the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. That bill has more than 50 bipartisan co-sponsors, 27 Democrats and 23 Republicans. Now, that's a bipartisan bill. That bill deserves a markup. That bill was negotiated for more than 9 months, and it has an identical bipartisan bill that was introduced in the Senate. And that bill, the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, has been supported by 60 Jewish organizations all across the ideological spectrum. Let me reassure you, it is highly unusual to have 60 Jewish organizations across the ideological spectrum agree on anything, but they agree on supporting the Countering Anti-Semitism Act. I wish that this committee had chosen to mark up that bill, because that is the bill we should be discussing in this hearing. It is well negotiated, it is comprehensive, and it would have more than a piecemeal, address things on more than a piecemeal basis. Nevertheless, Here we are. We have a crisis of anti-Semitism on our campuses. Jewish students are harassed, isolated, intimidated, discriminated against. This is a five-alarm fire, and I want to do whatever we can do to stop that isolation, harassment, and discrimination of Jewish students on our college campuses. So I am happy to support the bills that we were able to get brought to the floor here, and I have some amendments that I will address later to try to make this bill more comprehensive and more acceptable to others. I just want to make those remarks, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Manning. There being no further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, the committee will move to consideration of amendments. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek to be recognized?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8648 offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia. Identifier SCOTVA_028.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes to discuss his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier during the debate on the ANS, I expressed my concerns about case processing reforms proposed in H.R. 8648. The amendment I have would not allay these concerns, but would go a long way in ensuring that any process reforms Congress mandates on OCR in this bill will be offset with additional funds for that office. This amendment would authorize OCR at $280 million a year, a level double the President's fiscal request of 2025. This authorization is necessary in light of the fact that other provisions in the underlying bill could seriously increase the number of cases pending at OCR. Recognizing this, we should authorize funds necessary to meet that challenge. I'm aware that this is just an authorization, not an appropriation. Such a direct appropriation by making the funds mandatory spending would not be in order at this time, but I would note that Senator from Pennsylvania, Mr. Casey, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman, have a bill, the Showing Up for Students Act, which would directly appropriate the same sum for OCR. My hope is that as we enter the appropriation season on the floor, we can send a bipartisan message to our colleagues on the Labor HHS Appropriations Subcommittee that we support OCR and its work and want to provide it with the necessary resources to ensure that it can do its work that it's being tasked to do. Thank you, Madam Chair, and hope we'd adopt the amendment. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I must oppose the gentleman's amendment. As the gentleman knows, we've worked very closely with his staff on this bill, and while they're choosing to oppose it, I hold out hope that we can eventually get them on board for supporting greater transparency around how colleges and universities investigate complaints under Title VI. With all due respect to my colleague, this amendment doesn't advance that effort. As he well knows, our committee doesn't control funding for the Office of Civil Rights. That funding comes out of the Appropriations Committee. Even if we adopted this amendment, it would have precisely zero impact on the amount of funding the Office of Civil Rights is receiving now or will receive in the future. On top of that, the Biden administration does not believe it needs this much to run the Office for Civil Rights. The FY 2025 budget proposal from the administration proposes to fund OCR at $162 million, a significantly lower number than what is being offered today. This bill is about ensuring that colleges and universities are transparent with their students about how Title VI complaints will be investigated, and it's about ensuring that the Office for Civil Rights is following its procedures and properly carrying out investigations. We've had productive conversations on this bill up to this point, and I hope we can get back to that as soon as we move to the floor. I urge members to reject this amendment and support the underlying bill, and I yield back. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment from the gentleman from Virginia? There being no further debate on the amendment in the to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, I ask those in favor of the amendment to all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Virginia requests a recorded vote. A roll call vote is ordered pursuant to the chair's previous announcement. This vote will be postponed. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8648? Ms. Manning, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to start by once again thanking my friend and colleague, Representative Chavez DeRemer of Oregon, for her leadership and her willingness to work together on this issue. As I talk to students about the frightening rise of anti-Semitism...
Ms. Manning, you did not designate your amendment.
I apologize, Madam Chair. The amendment, I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment Manning 59.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8640 offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina, identifier MANNIN_059.
The gentlewoman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you. And I would like once again to thank my good friend and colleague, Representative Chavez DeRemer, for her leadership and her willingness to work together on this issue. As I talk to students about the frightening rise of anti-Semitism and hate incidents on college campuses, it has become very clear to me that many are not aware of the protections provided to them under Title VI, particularly because Title VI does not explicitly protect discrimination based solely on religion. While increasing transparency is a good thing, it's hard to enforce Title VI protections if students aren't aware of what constitutes prohibited discrimination. The Department of Education has taken and should continue taking steps to improve this situation, and that's why my amendment would require the OCR to launch an anti-Semitism awareness campaign, providing technical assistance and guidance to schools, and take other steps to make sure that students know their rights. And I have one example of what schools can do. I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter into the record a fact sheet from the U.S. Department of Education released in January 2023 entitled Protecting Students from Discrimination Based on Shared Ancestry or Ethnic Characteristics.
Without objection.
Thank you. My amendment would simply ensure that colleges and universities help publicize and distribute relevant guidance, fact sheets, and materials from the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights to help make students aware of their Title VI protections. This common sense amendment is based on Section 5 of the Protecting Students on Campus Act, bipartisan bicameral legislation first introduced by Senators Bill Cassidy and John Fetterman. I urge support for my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? I recognize myself. I thank the gentlewoman for her amendment, believe it's a good amendment, and I plan to support it. Does anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? As there's no further debate on the gentlewoman's amendment, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Ms. Manning, you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk, Manning 060.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8648 offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina. Identifier MANNIN_060.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My second amendment to the ANS would help improve OCR's efforts to counter the stunning rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses by requiring the department to designate a senior official responsible for overseeing the department's efforts to counter anti-Semitism. In the fight against anti-Semitism on college campuses, we must use every tool available to help ensure that schools and universities take the proper steps to protect Jewish students from discrimination, harassment, and isolation. My amendment would direct the department to designate a senior official with specific responsibilities, including providing recommendations to the Secretary and Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights on countering anti-Semitism. This official would also be able to proactively visit colleges and universities to provide guidance on how to comply with Title VI and counter anti-Semitism. This amendment does not establish any new authority. It simply requires the Secretary to use authority he already has to appoint an official who is dedicated to the fight against anti-Semitism. That being said, I will be withdrawing this amendment because of objections that have been raised. I would have been open to addressing those objections and think I could have had a fix, but I only learned about those objections 10 minutes ago, and we certainly don't have time to produce a revised amendment that I think would have made people happy. That, sadly, is the result of rushing a bill to markup. But I wanted to raise this issue because I do think it's important, and I hope we can work together on this in the future on a bipartisan and planful way. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back, and I thank her for withdrawing the amendment. Does any other member wish to seek recognition? Ms. Manning, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk, Manning 061, and this is my last amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8648 offered by Ms. Manning of North Carolina. Identifier MANNIN_061.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My third and final amendment to the ANS would add an authorization for funding to help the Department of Education and Office of Civil Rights implement this bill. The OCR is dealing with an unprecedented rise in cases. We want to empower them to be able to fully investigate each and every case, to clear the backlog of pending cases, and reach more successful binding settlements with colleges and universities before the students who make the complaints actually graduate. Unfortunately, this bill requires the department to do a lot more without the requisite resources to do so. That is essentially an unfunded mandate. That is why my amendment would simply authorize funding over the next 5 fiscal years to implement this bill. If we support the approach taken by the bill, then we should have no problem making clear that we would also support relevant funding, which could be provided in separate appropriations legislation. I say to my colleagues, if we really care about combating anti-Semitism, it is not simply enough to have flashy hearings to hold college presidents to task and grab news headlines. If we really want OCR to be more effective in keeping students safe, we need to give OCR the funding necessary to do the job. Let's put our money where our mouths are. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Are there further amendments, or is there anyone who wishes to speak on this amendment? I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Unfortunately, I must oppose the gentlewoman's amendment. With all due respect to my colleague, the amendment doesn't advance the effort to increase the transparency of the Title VI investigation on college campuses, nor does it do anything to encourage OCR to follow their investigative procedures. We've had productive conversations on this bill with the ranking member up to this point. I also know that the gentlewoman has been interested in combating the explosion of anti-Semitism on college campuses. That's why we have sought her feedback on this bill. Unfortunately, she chose not to engage with us. I hope that will change as we move to the floor. I urge members to reject the show vote and support the underlying bill, and I yield back. We'll now, are there any further amendments? We'll now move to, there being no further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Okay. If there's no further debate on the amendment, the question is on the amendment by the gentlewoman from North Carolina. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it and the amendment's not agreed to. The gentlewoman asked for a recorded vote. A roll call vote is ordered. Pursuant to the chair's previous announcement, this vote will be postponed. Yeah. We now move to consider the next bill. Committee will now proceed to consideration of the resolution HJ Res 165 for amendment. The resolution was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
HJ Res 165, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rule submitted by the Department of Education relating to non-discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance.
Without objection, the first reading of the resolution is dispensed with. Are there members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the resolution? Ms. Miller, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 1972, Congress enacted Title IX with the goal of giving our girls and women more opportunities, not biological men. Since then, Title IX has paved the way for our girls to access new opportunities in education, scholarships, and athletics. Unfortunately, Joe Biden is destroying all that progress. I am proud to be leading the effort to overturn Joe Biden's unlawful and radical reinterpretation of Title IX. Joe Biden and his Democrat enablers in Congress claim that the Supreme Court's ruling in Bostock makes their interpretation of Title IX legitimate. This is a lie. The Supreme Court specifically said in their ruling that Bostock should not be applied to Title IX or any civil rights law. But they don't care. They're stripping students, educators, and parents of their legal rights. Joe Biden has made it illegal to disagree with the radical left's view of gender. This is a blatant violation of students' and educators' free speech rights. And worst of all, this rule enshrines in law the left's ongoing war against parental rights. This rule also doubles down on the radical left's attack on biology, at the same time that medical associations around the world are waking up to the harm that's being done by these policies. The American people, they are fed up with men taking away the athletic opportunities from our girls, and they're horrified at the prospect of our girls having to shower with men and share the locker room with them. Democrats are telling us loud and clear they don't care about our girls. And if you disagree, Joe Biden is going to punish you and take federal money away from your schools. Madam Chair, my Democrat colleagues have said that overturning this rule would be an act of hate. I say that Joe Biden's Title IX rule is an act of hate. Someone must stand up and say enough, and I'm glad we're doing that today. Thank you. I urge adoption of this rule, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Are there other members who wish to speak?
Thank you. Go ahead.
Ms. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Under the previous administration, Secretary DeVos advanced a discriminatory and a harmful misinterpretation of Title IX. Her approach diminished the rights of survivors of sexual assault and also failed to enforce civil rights protections for LGBTQ+ students. The Biden administration has worked hard to fix this misguided policy, and the proposed regulations take into account hours of listening sessions and more than 150,000 public comments. The new Title IX rule strengthens protections for vulnerable student populations, including the LGBTQ+ community, and for the first time, Title IX explicitly prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The Bostock case was a civil rights case. The regulations also strike the right balance between maintaining due process rights for offenders and protecting survivors of sex-based harassment and assault, something that the former department failed to do. The department's proposed regulations are timely and necessary, especially following the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs, which decimated reproductive rights and access to abortion for individuals nationwide. Lack of access to adequate reproductive care affects educational opportunities, career outcomes, and earning potential, and the effects are disproportionately felt by Black, brown, and low-income students. In short, the Title IX rule fulfills the federal government's responsibility to protect students and staff from discrimination on the basis of sex, empowering them to thrive academically and professionally. Invoking the Congressional Review Act is not only unnecessary but deeply harmful. It shows students and staffs that we do not consider their rights worthy of protection and their identities worthy of respecting. I encourage my colleagues to vote, all of my colleagues, to vote against this harmful resolution and reject all attacks on Title IX, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. Mr. Scott,
Thank you, Madam.
you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to point out that this rule does not speak to eligibility to sports. That issue will be taken up in a later rule. Title IX prohibits discrimination in education on the basis of sex, whether my colleagues like it or not. The Trump-appointed Justice Neil Gorsuch held that protections of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act against workforce discrimination because of sex must be interpreted to include discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. The court, in the wake of that opinion in the case of Bostock v. Clayton County, had the opportunity to hear cases that raised the question as to whether or not the same interpretation holds for Title IX. Lower courts have held that it does. The Supreme Court has refused to hear appeals on those cases, letting those interpretations stand. So to the extent my colleagues have a problem with the rule before us based on the interpretation of sex, that problem does not lie with the Department of Education, but with the Supreme Court. Further, I find it baffling that this committee has spent 6 months and over 5 hearings investigating the existence of hostile learning environments in education settings and then decides to bring the CRA bill to the committee for reasons they have publicly stated. We know that LGBTQI students experience disproportionate harassment and discrimination while trying to learn and grow up like every other student simply because of who they are. Title IX rule in question today will provide critical protections for students so that they can learn in an environment free from discrimination, harassment, and violence. This is something my colleagues have been demanding for certain groups of students, and as lawmakers, we should be demanding it for all students, regardless of their race, national origin, shared ancestry, sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this joint resolution and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Ms. McLean, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I speak in support of House Joint Resolution 165 to block President Biden's attempt to undermine Title IX and erase vital protections for women and girls in American schools. Title IX was created to ensure women and girls have the same educational opportunities as boys in school across the country. As Title IX enters its 52nd year, its legacy for fostering fair competition and education for women is under attack by the radical left. Title IX was meant to give girls the space they needed to showcase their skills. Instead of honoring this legacy, the Biden administration and the bureaucracy of the Department of Education is hell-bent on harming the very women Title IX was placed to protect. The rule to redefine sex discrimination on the basis of gender identity will force schools to provide biological men who claim they are women access to women's locker rooms and bathrooms. This ignores the biological differences between men and women and puts our daughters, my daughters, in grave danger. This joint resolution is about protecting our daughters and their ability to learn and compete in a safe environment. President Biden has proven that he will do anything to appease the radicals in his party rather than defend the success of women athletes and Title IX. Our daughters deserve better. Your daughters deserve better. And we owe it to them to fight for the sanctity of women to have safe spaces. I'll make it simple for the Democrats. Men do not belong in women's spaces. The fact that I need to say that is a sad reflection of where the other side is on this aisle. The simple fact is that we are here today because the Biden administration is putting leftist policies over the protection of our daughters, of our women, and our girls. If the Biden administration goes down this path, it will mean more women will lose out on academics and athletics. Since when are we so discriminatory against women? I don't understand that. I mean, they should have opportunities. Women and girls should have opportunities that were afforded to them under Title IX. Remember, we fought so hard for Title IX, for women. Right? Remember the women's lib generation? Right? I am proud to co-sponsor this common sense legislation and to urge my colleagues, support your daughters and vote for this legislation. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Mr. Good, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
On April 29, 2024, the Department of Ed released a rule changing Title IX of the Education Amendment of 1972 to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and the definition of sex. With a stroke of a pen, the Biden administration destroyed Title IX's promises of equal opportunity for women and eradicated sex-protected spaces like bathrooms, locker rooms, and campus housing for students from kindergarten through grad school. The Title IX rule forces schools to adopt the left's radical worldview that sex is something that can change on a whim, something that's chosen or decided, as opposed to it being scientifically embedded in our DNA. Of course, the folks on the other side, the Democrat Party, supports young children self-diagnosing gender dysphoria, and then adults' ability to abuse them, young children, via puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and even surgery to forever maim them, disfigure them for the rest of their life. It's clear from this rule that the left would rather perpetrate the harm of gender confusion than stand up for women and girls. Unless Congress or the courts intervene, the Biden administration's rule will go into effect on August 1. So next year, don't be surprised when you see more boys joining girls' sports teams. And you can thank President Biden when your daughter finds out that her freshman roommate is actually a man. Brace yourself for the onslaught of investigations at the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights when teachers and students who refuse to use non-biological pronouns are reported. So I thank Representative Miller for her courage, her leadership, and her effort, her relentless effort to protect women and girls in locker rooms, defend women in sports, and to follow the science, the God-created science. And I'm proud to support this legislation. I urge all of my colleagues to nullify the Biden administration's rule by supporting H.J. Res. 165, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good. Mr. Moran, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fox. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
Today, I rise in support of House Joint Resolution 165, introduced by my colleague, Representative Mary Miller from Illinois. I come with deep concerns regarding the Biden administration's Department of Education final rule released on May 3rd, 2024, regarding Title IX that redefines sex to include, quote, sexual orientation and gender identity. This rule blatantly disregards the longstanding interpretation of the word sex, undermines the intended mission of Title IX, and removes protections for women and girls in our education system. The Biden administration's Title IX rule belies the legislative intent of the statute, which was to ensure equal access to educational and athletic opportunities for women on campuses, and this new rule unfortunately achieves the exact opposite. Title IX was written with the understanding that there are two distinct sexes, male and female. This foundational biological truth, if unwound, makes Title IX protections irrelevant and unnecessary. The final rule issued by the Department of Education, which redefines sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity, blatantly ignores years of precedent and only creates more confusion for institutions. It blurs the lines of biology, of statutory construction, and of common sense. What's more, this rule rolls back years of advancements for women and girls in education, like my two daughters, and erodes the fundamental principles and purposes of Title IX. Egregiously, this rule goes so far as to withhold funds to schools if they do not allow students to use restrooms or locker rooms based on their proclaimed gender identity. This unprecedented rule is dangerous and is another example of the administration ignoring the will of parents, children, and local school districts, not to mention common sense and the natural laws of this world. This blatant government overreach in search of a radical social agenda rooted in moral relativism is unacceptable to me as a father and as a legislator. And I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this resolution to roll back the Biden administration's ill-conceived attempt to further blur the lines between men and women. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. Dr. Adams, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized.
I rise in opposition to this resolution. We cannot allow this attempt at fear-mongering overshadow how groundbreaking this new rule is for so many students in our country. These changes provide much-needed clarification on what schools are obligated to do in cases of sexual harassment and discrimination. They strengthen the requirement for schools to respond promptly and equitably in their investigations. They also significantly strengthen protections for pregnant and parenting students. These regulations require schools to provide pregnant students with information on the school's obligations and accommodations they must offer, including voluntary leaves of absence and lactation spaces. They also explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. As a professor of 40 years, I deeply value the role that education has in student lives. And every student deserves a quality education, free of harassment and discrimination. This final rule is an excellent step in the right direction for our students, and I'm proud to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I move to strike the last word and rise in opposition to this resolution.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
The Department of Education issued a final rule this past April. This rule is a triumph. It strengthens protections against sex-based harassment and clarifies protections for LGBTQI plus pregnant and parenting students. This rule makes significant strides in repairing the damage that the Trump administration's Title IX rule established. Under the DeVos Department of Ed, a lack of explicit protections and enforcement powers excluded many women, LGBTQ, and pregnant and parenting students from the full freedom to pursue a quality education. The Republican objection that sex discrimination should be interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender identity will tear down all of the protections that this essential rule clarifies. Let's be clear. The Title IX rule does not create new rights for LGBTQ plus students, but simply clarifies how the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Bostock v. Clayton County should be interpreted in school environments. This is a population of students in need. Currently, 83% of LGBTQ plus students, LGBTQI plus students, face victimization at school. States with laws that target LGBTQI plus students have seen the number of hate crimes quadruple in the last 5 years, or the last few years. And this is a youth population that has among the highest statistics of anxiety, depression, suicidality, and youth homelessness. It is our obligation to support these kids and defend their right to what every child in America should have: access to a high-quality education free from fear and victimization. Instead, my colleagues across the aisle have chosen to use their bully pulpit to ensure that LGBTQI plus kids do not have the same rights and freedoms as their peers. They are going out of the way to remove all the protections this rule offers through this CRA, and all to dispute the definition of a single phrase. This CRA would have disastrous consequences for countless students that saw their right to education dissolve under the Trump Title IX rule. Survivors of sexual harassment and assault will continue to face significant barriers to completing their education if this CRA comes to pass. This CRA is a roadmap not only to wipe out the entire rule, but also tie the hands of a federal agency from undertaking any federal rulemaking related to these topics. This is a cruel, dangerous, and shameful waste of this committee's time during Pride Month nonetheless. I urge opposition to the joint resolution, and I yield back, Madam Chair.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. It's very disturbing to hear some of the comments that are being made about this resolution and what was done under the Trump administration. The Biden administration's rule says that men must be given access to girls' locker rooms, bathrooms, and athletic teams. By stating that schools' obligations to comply with Title IX is not alleviated by FERPA, the rule will seemingly force school districts to adopt the pernicious practice of hiding information from parents about their children's medical and emotional health. Democrats are saying that this rule doesn't affect women's sports. That's not true. While the Department of Education is sitting on a separate regulation dealing specifically with athletics, which it will presumably release after the election, The Biden administration is already working hard to rip athletic opportunities away from women and girls. This rule we're debating today includes no carve-out for athletics. The Biden administration also intervened in a court case in West Virginia in opposition to a state law ensuring that only biological women would participate in women's sports. To be clear, this rule is not about protecting LGBTQ students from sexual harassment. Title IX already does that. I'm going to repeat that. Title IX already protects LGBTQ students. As the Trump administration wrote in the preamble to its 2020 Title IX regulations, the Department of Education will not tolerate sexual harassment against any student, including LGBTQ students. No, this rule is about forcing children, their parents, and their schools to accept the left's dangerous and radical gender ideology, the left's blatant and intentional attempts to redefine our sons' and daughters' identities by questioning biology itself has already done significant harm to our children and society. It will do even more if this rule stands. The rule is also wrong legally. The Biden administration justifies its interpretation of Title IX by pointing to the Supreme Court's ruling in Bostock versus Clayton County, Bostock. However, as Mrs. Miller has already said, the Biden administration ignores the Supreme Court's own explicit warning against interpreting Bostock opinion as applying to Title IX or other civil rights laws protecting sex discrimination. In that case, the court stated, quote, "But none of these other laws are before us. We have not had the benefit of adversarial testing about the meaning of their terms, and we do not prejudge any such question today. Under Title VII-2, we do not purport to address bathrooms, locker rooms, or anything else of the kind." In addition, this rule violates the Supreme Court's major questions doctrine. In West Virginia versus EPA, the Supreme Court prohibited agencies from resolving questions of, quote, "vast economic and political significance," unquote, without clear statutory authorizations. There are other troubling provisions in the regulation. Hidden within the pages is an attack on the First Amendment. The rule will force students and educators to accept the left's radical anti-science views of biology or be punished. The rule's expansion of what constitutes sexual harassment will further stifle students' free speech rights. The rule strips due process rights from students accused of violating sexual harassment policies. The rule allows institutions to return to single investigator models in which one staff member serves as investigator, judge, and jury. The rule eliminates the rights of students on college campuses to a live hearing in which competing claims can be fairly evaluated, and access to evidence for the accused has been curtailed. I yield back. To HJ Res 165, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the resolution is agreed to. And that,
Chair, can I enter something into the record at this point? Well, I just want the
without
record.
objection, the gentlewoman is recognized out of turn to put something in the record.
I just want to clarify something, because the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in Virginia, ruled that policies that segregate transgender students and deny them accurate transcripts are unconstitutional and violate Title IX. And I just want to clarify that.
If the gentlewoman would like, the gentlewoman's time's expired, but the gentlewoman wants to enter that into the record.
I will enter something into the record about that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Scott, you're recognized.
And did we get a recorded vote on the resolution?
A recorded vote has been requested. A recorded vote will be later in the process. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of the excuse me. Oops. The committee now proceed to the consideration of the bill H.R. 6816 for amendment.